Okay, well, hello again. I'm Ella Tandello. I'm Emerita Fellow at Christchurch, Oxford, and I'm one of the Oxford crowd, so to speak. And I have the great pleasure and privilege to introduce two major Zanzottiani and Zanzottisti to talk about translating Zanzotto into English. Now, they are both very famous, and I will give a really very brief introduction. Peter Hainsworth is Emeritus Fellow of Lady Margaret Hall. Sorry? Hello? Can you hear me, Adele? Yes, okay. His translations of Zanzotto have appeared in the TLS, as well as in Modern Poetry in Translation. He has translated, amongst other things, from Galateo in Bosco and Di Personetto. John Welle is Professor Emeritus, again, of Italian Studies, Film, Television and Theatre at Notre Dame. And his translations from Zanzotto have appeared in the second edition of Selected Poetry and Prose of Andrea Zanzotto that came out with Chicago Press in 2007. He has also translated Philo integrally for Illinois Press. That had actually come out in 1997. I hope I haven't left anything crucial out. The task of translators, Anne Carson has a lovely line in her translation from Sophocles' Antigone. And she addressing Antigone, she says, "My task as translator is to get you." And of course, it is to get the text, but also to convey the text and to make sure that the voice is heard and continues to be heard. My first point is a point about reception, and I wanted to ask both of you about the reception of Zanzotto in English-speaking countries, and that there may be, we may think that his poetry is considered particularly problematic in countries, in English-speaking countries, and you might not agree with me, but I wanted to kick off with reception and with your role as translators, aiming to convey a poetry that perhaps is considered a little difficult. Pete, do you want to start?
I can start responding to that. In fact, actually, paradoxically as it may sound, I saw Philo as an opportunity to try to present the poetry of Andrea Zanzotto to a wider audience than, let's say, that might be a little bit more. So he's known as a difficult elite poet, but I think, and this I misunderstood the question of Francesca Cadell earlier when she said, "Can you speak of Zanzotto as a pop poet?" When I heard that, I was thinking about in his poetry how he uses, American mass media, how he responds to that. But I think what she meant rather has to do also with your point about reception, that there is a side of Zanzotto that is very available, that is, affabile, to use an Italian word. And I think Philo, although you have there's the problem of the dialect, obviously, it's a poem, it's a wonderful poem. It stands on its own. And it becomes an occasion to be able to speak about Zanzotto. So the point isn't that you've mastered the translation of the dialect, but you are introducing to English-speaking readers this question that's going on in Italy. And so I think my first response is that, you had 1975, Ruth Feldman and Brian Swan's selected poetry of Andrea Zanzotto with Princeton University Press, and with a preface by Glauco Cambon, which is an excellent brief introduction to Zanzotto, and well translated. And Princeton University Press, the Lockhart series, is a very prestigious series. So that was something where Ruth Feldman and Brian Swan hit the nail right on the head. They managed to accomplish that, and that was a good start, I think. And I wonder, certain American poets have made it clear that they read Zanzotto. And I think that that translation has probably done a great deal. And I have more to say about that, but I don't want to. I have some own remarks that I prepare that touch on this, but I don't want to launch into that unless you want.
No, but we've got. I mean, that will come. I was wondering whether Peter wanted to say something about this.
Sure. Yeah. I would like to say something about this. I think that a certain kind of Zanzotto, the kind that John is talking about, is very approachable in English in one form or another. It's a poetry which poses the usual difficulties for poetry translation. There's always going to be things lost. But that poetry of Philon, some of the early poetry, and then later dialect poetry actually can pass into English and be readable by a poetry readership in the English-speaking countries without much difficulty. It will seem like, in some cases, I think, English poetry, if it's translated sympathetically. That's okay, that's good. But the poetry that we think of as being characteristic of Zanzotto, the poetry from La Beltà onwards, is much more hard for English-speaking readers to connect with. In the early 1980s, I sent some versions of some poems from Galateo in Bosco to Modern Poetry and Translation. And the editor, who was an English poet, a friend of mine, wrote back after some weeks and said that he couldn't take it because he couldn't understand it, and anybody he'd shown it to couldn't just understand it either. And the understanding is the word that I remember, but what it obviously embraced was any sympathy with that kind of poetry. There was a feeling that those jumps syntactically, the shifts in register from one form of writing to another, the use of nonsense, the self-corrections apparently that take place in those poems didn't add up to anything that anybody could understand. And one can see why, because it's totally alien to the kind of poetry that's being produced, has been being produced in this country for a long time. If one thinks of post-war English poetry, it does not use anything like these tricks, as they would well often be seen in this country. It is not something which poets do. The cult of poetry in this country is a cult, on the whole, of normal language in one form or another that brings out perhaps the subtleties of the normal language, but doesn't go off into either English poetic tradition, say from the 19th century backwards, or into linguistic invention. In fact, one could argue that it's a rather monotonous register to modern English poetry. And I'm not sure, from my knowledge of it, that from this perspective, American poetry isn't that different. It too, I think, prefers to use a form of normal language, maybe literary language, but it's normal language. So to find yourself face to face with Zanzotto's language is a problem. It's a problem if any translator reproduces, perhaps at one remove, with adaptations, whatever, the things that Zanzotto is doing. It just doesn't go into the modern English idiom. If you think particularly now of the cult of oral poetry as it's practiced in this country, it's a long, long way from Zanzotto as he was writing in the 1980s and 1990s. So a great difficulty in terms of sympathy for Zanzotto, I think, and Zanzotto's poetry. The kind of poems that will translate are the earlier poems, and I think the dialect poems. I was looking at a dialect poem, a very short one, to the woman who goes sewing, va cucire, and it translated, in my translation, it reads more or less like an English poem. And I could see that were I to try to sell that poem in translation to an English magazine, they might take it, they might think it by itself is a bit drab, not all that interesting. It might need a lot of filling out in some way, but it could pass off as an English poem, maybe. Whereas so many other poems, the characteristic Zanzotto poems, don't do that. So I think there is a real problem of reception for what we've often thought of as the most interesting, valid, exciting poetry of Zanzotto in the English-speaking world. A real problem. And I don't think it's been overcome, and I don't think it will be overcome in the near future.
It's very interesting to hear your respective responses to this, because clearly we're dealing with two different cultural contexts and linguistic contexts. We've already started to talk in many ways about, you know, the choice of which Zanzotto you chose to translate. Sorry, I just want to open a very small parenthesis. Adele and Roberto, my internet is playing up a little bit. So, you know, I just want to warn you that is happening. I wanted to talk, I would like to ask you both to talk about your choice of texts, because you have chosen from Galateo in Bosco, which is a challenging text. What your approach has been. It seems to me that in both your cases, you know, the texts do work as poetic texts in English. And which I find is a very important point. But I wanted to ask you about your approach and why you chose such challenging texts and how you went about translating them.
John?
No, go ahead, Peter.
John, do go ahead.
Okay. All right. Look, I'll go ahead for the moment. I was attracted to Zanzotto. I think Zanzotto's a very great poet, I think. I have spent a lot of my time as an academic working on Petrarch. I don't have translated some Petrarch. I'd done quite a lot of Petrarch translation already in the 1980s, and then continued to that, and I've published a selection of Petrarch's poetry. So I was particularly struck by the Petrarchan resonances, or debts, whatever you want to call them, in Zanzotto and in parts of Galateo in Bosco, especially in I Personetto. And I was very impressed with the way in which Zanzotto reworked Petrarchan conventions or Petrarchist conventions, because, of course, he's got in mind the Renaissance versions of Petrarch and the recreations of Petrarch in the Renaissance, not just Petrarch himself. So I found those poems of I Personetto particularly interesting. I loved the way in which the modern and the traditional were brought together and clashed in a technically very assured and brilliant way, in a Petrarchist manner, I think, rather than a Petrarchan manner. I liked the use of the sonnet, the traditional sonnet form, in a semi-ironic way. And I thought that the Ipersonetto was also a sequence of poems that said a lot about Zanzotto. And in fact, when I sent them to Zanzotto, I had some correspondence with Zanzotto, not a great deal. He wrote back and said that he liked the translations. He had some corrections to my introductory note. I put the Monsignor de la Casa in the wrong place, I think, in my introductory note. So Zanzotto put me right about where he, Monsignor de la Casa, was writing. But he said about Ipersonetto, io mi identifico un po' con questo mio Ipersonetto. Giving the impression that there was a lot of him concentrated into Ipersonetto, which is very much what I felt. I felt that Ipersonetto does bring together an enormous amount of what Zanzotto is doing. So this attracted me very much. But there was also, from the point of view of translation, I also had this feeling that I could, in some way, do in English something like what Zanzotto was doing. I could preserve the sonnet form, I could preserve the rhymes, I could move between one level of language and another. And so I did that. So and when I sent these versions to Modern Poetry in Translation, these were turned down too, on the grounds that they didn't seem quite right. But I thought they were okay, and I still do. And eventually they did come out under a later editor in Modern Poetry in Translation. I felt that I had got something of Zanzotto. I don't have a theory of translation. I've done now quite a bit of translation. I feel very much that it's important for the translator to have as Emanuela said, a kind of agenda, a poetic agenda or a translation agenda. And that, I think, means a vision of the text you're translating. So I had a very definite vision of what this text was and what it was doing. And it's one that appealed to me. The result may have been that it was more, it was to some degree me as much as it was Zanzotto, perhaps even more so. I think I probably emphasized more the sort of energy as that I saw in the text, and in some ways the playfulness of the text. And perhaps other translators wouldn't have done that. But I did have a line on the text, and I do think as a translator, it's important to have a line on the text. So not a theory of translation, but a practice and a vision of translation. So this Ipersonetto drew me in that way, in that it was a recreation and problematization of Petrarch in modern Italian, which I thought offered something like the same scope to a translator. I also enjoyed it, and I thought that was important. I enjoyed the practice of translation. I enjoyed looking around for the rhymes in a way that Keats did, to look for an eminent predecessor, searching around for rhymes, and felt quite self-satisfied, even smug to have found the rhymes that I did find. And occasionally I found myself adding a little bit to Zanzotto. I'll quote one ending of a poem, if I can find it, at the very end of the 11th one, che fai, che pensi, ed a chi mai chi parla. And Zanzotto ends with, asks various questions. And at the end, he says, pensier di non pensier, pensa, che pensi? And I find that a remarkably good and forceful and ironic and amusing closure. And then when I translated it, I added another think. So I actually got 5 thinks in, where Zanzotto only had 4, and had thought of non-thinking, think, what thinks your thought, which is not normal English, but it played perhaps exaggeratedly on the game that Zanzotto is playing. I think I did something similar else in other poems. So that was more or less me being taking action with impersonetto, taking action being possibly the word rather than meditating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you.
yes, I'd like to respond to that. I was also very much attracted to I Personetto, not so much as a translator. I admired Peter doing that, but as a reader, when I was a doctoral student, I was contemplating writing a doctoral dissertation on Guittone d'Arezzo.
Jesus.
And I went from reading Guittone d'Arezzo to reading Andrea Zanzotto.
Good for you.
And that was the road taken, you know.
Yeah.
I took the right fork in the road. And I think I was attracted because I had taught for the American Department of Defense in Italy for 3 years, 1 year in Brindisi and 2 years in Verona. And I think I was attracted to the poetry of Andrea Zanzotto because of the Veneto, also the themes of pedagogy, but also the forms of poetry. So it was good preparation. And I jumped in, and for why they let me write a dissertation on one poet and one book of poetry, you know, it's kind of crazy. Nobody could do that today, but that was fine. That was a great adventure. I wanted to, I don't know when I'll ever have a chance to tell this story. So, you know, I don't think there's going to be another Zanzotto conference at Oxford next week. But since you're mentioning your work on Petrarch, Peter, I was visiting Zanzotto one time, and he was extolling your virtues, and he was telling me what a great book you had written. And I remember very distinctly, he said, "Oh, quel Peter Hainsworth, il suo inglese così raffinato." You know, and he was so enthusiastic about your refined English prose writing that was, you know, kind of caught my attention. You know, that caught my attention because this is what I was trying. He's constantly underplaying his knowledge of English, but he was very enthusiastic about what he had written, and he was sharing that with me. So I think as a reader of Zanzotto, you know, I connect with Peter on that score. But the translation, and I also, maybe this is another point of overlap. I you know, had written a monograph on Il Galateon Bosco, and I wanted to continue, and I wanted, you know, I wanted to be able to walk into a bookstore in a English-speaking country and see more poetry of Andrea Zanzotto on the bookshelf. It was as simple as that. And I thought Philo presented an opportunity because it's approachable. And I actually had done a version, it was in monosyllables. So I thought, you know, I could, you know, reproduce the dialect by using monosyllables. And I remember the editor that I submitted to was Michael Schmidt. And maybe he was the editor of Modern Poetry and Translation. That could have been it. And he wrote back, you know, they weren't interested. And he saw what I was trying to do with the monosyllables, and it really wasn't working very well. But I was determined, you know, I wanted to see something in translation. And I came up with the idea of enlisting the help of Ruth Feldman, who I didn't know, and who over the course of really 6 or 7 years, we only met once face to face. So, but I could see that she had a track record as a translator. You know, she had a number of books in print, and she was publishing with, you know, with good presses. So she was clearly a name that I thought would help get something in print. So I wrote and asked her to consider collaborating, and she was rather reluctant, but eventually she said yes. And when I wrote to Andrea Zanzotto, and this was a conversation that went on for a long time about the dialect translate, etc. But he was very, very pleased and very happy that Ruth Feldman was joining me because, as he said at the time, she has a method, and she knows my poetry very well. But it was, so the choices were all mine, really. And I thought, Philo would try to build a project around Philo and all that entails. And I was there, and then added poems for consideration. And this was a long conversation for many years with Zanzotto in correspondence, face-to-face. And also he was very involved in the choice even of individual words. And he would make suggestions, and he would send me poems, and he would put notes in the margins that we say, this is not a note for the translation, but to help you understand better, he would clarify. So then we, then built around Philo, and Zanzotto, rightly so, thought, this is, I want to have, okay, if you're going to go forward with the dialect, and he had some thoughts about that, have a theoretical writing of his on dialect, which we have, which I think makes a difference. But it was, so the choices were all mine, and it became, so Philo, per lo Casanova di Fellini, has an integrity in relationship to the film and the texts. And the two poems that were discussed this morning, recita, the first poem, and then the Cantilena Londinese, Ruth did not want to include, she did not want to translate Cantilena Londinese, because just saying it's impossible to translate. It can't stand on its own as a poem. That was her criteria. That was her, she's, this we can't make this stand as a poem on its own, so it's not going to, we can't put it in. And of course, Andrea Zanzotto had a different view of that, and he was right, that it needs to be there for the integrity of the project. And so I just, I tried to translate it using some familiar folk or references to nursery rhymes. And I think at one point came up with Old Mother Goose when she started to wander, etc. So it was a kind of substitution that I hoped would at least carry that point of it. But the choice of the texts were always mine, and Ruth joined, and I think we worked well together as translators in that sometimes I gave ground because I thought she came up with a better solution. And other times I held my ground because I thought my solution was better than what she was proposing. And so I think what happened was a kind of third thing. It was not all mine, it was not all hers, but it was something that we produced together, even though, practically complete strangers, but we had this passion and love for the poetry of Andrea Zanzotto, and it took this form.
Thank you. You've both spoken about your relationship with Zanzotto, and the fact that you consulted with him over your translations. And I sort of get the feeling that you found that not just helpful, but also illuminating as a dialogue. You have translate. Sorry. So, but I was going to ask whether it was useful, to what extent, and generally when you translate, how important the input of the poet is about their texts.
Yeah, I keep normally to the dead, so they don't actually reply when I ask them questions. But they, with Zanzotto, I was going to say that Zanzotto is very distinctive, I think, among modern poets for being so much a self-commentator. And he does comment a lot on his work, but it also, the self-commentary goes into the poetry. There's a great deal of poetry about the poetry. You can argue that's what its subject is, its main subject. I think that's been come out today in some of the things I've heard. Well, myself, I largely refused that particular gambit and worked by myself on Zanzotto in the perhaps mistaken belief that poetry has to stand up under its own legs. Perhaps mistaken. You know, I don't want to be dogmatic about that, but that was something which I firmly believed when I did these translations. It's now a long time ago. I'm rather out of date, I'm afraid. So I did these translations a long time ago, and I subscribe very much to the idea that poetry stands as it is there on the page, and the interpreter, the reader, gives it, understands it, perhaps gives it meaning. So I didn't want to be in touch with Zanzotto from that point of view. So and my communications with Zanzotto were much less, excuse me, frequent than those of John. Indeed, I didn't know him at all well. I met him a couple of times. So I sent him my translations of I Personetto, hoping he would approve, and he did. And he made the few comments that I mentioned earlier. So I was working from in a way, a rather different perspective, one that fitted with a certain orthodoxy of the post-war period as regards read the text. The text is the thing that counts. What you don't do is then get elucidation from the writer to tell you what the text is. There is a certain kind of orthodoxy. I can now see that it's one which has got lots of problems, no longer subscribe to it in that way. So I think that John's approach will almost certainly have led to a richer reading of the text than the one that I was doing. Because if you're doing it entirely by yourself, then a certain amount of elimination of signification takes place, I think. Sorry.
Yes. Well, yes, I mean, for me, the best, this was a very stimulating experience to be in conversation, to be in dialogue with Andrea Zanzotto about translating his poetry. And I think there too, the fact that it was Philo led to, it was just a wonderful conversation to have. And I would share with you about, right from the beginning, there were two questions he had, two difficulties to overcome. First of all, he said, presenting to an American audience only my dialect poetry without an ample sampling of my poetry that I'm known for, as Peter was mentioning earlier, really distorts the view of my work. He said that the dialect poetry, while it represents a moment of experimentation that's very important, my whole work, he wrote, is una meditazione sul idioma idiomi. So that was the first problem he had. And then the second one was, if the distance between dialect and Italian is already very large, it's not possible to bridge the gap between the dialect and standard English. He said, you're going to need to find a patois or slang that nevertheless is widely known in Anglophone areas. And then he sent me, I think this is so nice, he sent me the address of Professor Frederick Tuttle at UCLA. You might still be around USC and UCLA. He was quite a character. He taught the history of the language. He was a very expert glottologist, dialect specialist with a great knowledge. And so Andrea Zanzotto thought I should contact him and ask him for advice for this project. And that was well-meaning, but that was really not very helpful to me. You know, I had already quite a bit of experience with the very, with Italian literary criticism, American academic literary studies. I pretty much felt I knew that world, and that's really not what I had in mind. I was hoping to try to bring some poetry to a wider audience, and I didn't really think going deeper into the fine details that were important, that were also very well presented this morning in that paper. But also then, if I may, so with the question of translating the dialect, at the time, Miller Williams, who was a poet and a translator, was also an editor at the University of Arkansas Press, and he had translated Romanesco of Welle. So he produced a very fine small book of translations of Welle. So this was translations of dialect that was going on. Herman Haller also is translating Cesare Pasquarella. Someone else actually, I think it was some kind of celebration, centennial was coming up. So Pasquarella was on the radar screen. And so another English translation of Pasquarella came out. So we weren't totally in the woods. And I think Miller Williams wrote something in a preface to the choice of his English translations. And he said that he thought it was a mistake to try to find some kind of, to go into some American dialect or British dialect, whether it's Cockney or, some dialect in Scotland, or whether it's Brooklyn or whatever it is. He thought it was a mistake to try to make this kind of a trade to find something that would be equivalent. And I think he said, wrote something like, to the people of Trastevere, this is the way people talk. So I think the point was just to try to go for a spoken language that is accessible to people. And so, I already mentioned this morning that fundamental important choice that he made, Zanzotto made for the title, Finnegan's Wake, Peasant's Wake. He wanted the allusion to Joyce. I want just also one example of the collaboration with him. I mean, I saw this, like the collaboration with Ruth that he was very enthusiastic about, but he also, I think, he joined in. But I remember one time at the Zanzotto house, and we were going over some of the translations in Philo, I believe it was. And I tried to tell him there really wasn't a word in English. It wasn't midola, but it was a dialect word distinguishing about some parts of bread. And he looked at me like, that can't be. And he went in and got the dictionary, and he came back, he said, yeah. So I saw that. But so it was an interesting, I learned a lot, and it was a very rich experience. And all the exchanges in correspondence and also face-to-face were very enjoyable.
Yeah, thank you.
Well,
Thank you very much. Pete, sorry.
I must say that I, in general, I'm opposed to translating dialect into another dialect, because if your aim is to bring poetry to a wider audience, it won't happen if you translate it into another dialect. There's possibly some grounds for thinking that you could translate it into the dialect of Lallans, of Scottish, Scottish English, because that's got quite a wide readership and quite a literary tradition of its own. But it's still going to be extremely limited because most of us need a translation of Lallans into normal English if it's going to use anything like a wide vocabulary and a precise vocabulary. So I think that the last thing I want to read is a translation which has to have a translation in it. I think that is hopeless. It's going nowhere. I find it very interesting that when Zanzotto wrote in dialect, he wrote in, even later in his career, he wrote in this extremely intelligible way, but it was in dialect. that which meant that in a sense it wasn't intelligible, but within the confines of dialect, in the kind of protection that dialect gave, Zanzotto could be approachable and intelligible in a way that he couldn't be in, I think, if he was trying to write in some version of the normal Italian. I don't think he was unique in this. I think it has been something that a lot of dialect poets in Italy have done. That is, the dialect has provided a frame or an enclosure within which they can say things in a fairly direct and simple way, in a way that they feel they can't, but probably rightly, in the standard language. I think Zanzotto followed that practice and it's fine, but the translator can't do the same unless he or she has a similar literary community in mind. And none of us have, because with the Lallans may be an exception, but most of us are actually dealing with an English language or an American language with a very large readership potentially there, which reads English and American or possibly Australian or whatever, but it's not going to be that sort of dialectal culture that does exist in Italy and which offers particular possibilities that are not offered by any form of English writing. I think I could be opening up a can of worms here. But anyway,
no, it's not a can of worms, but it is a very large topic, because of course, you know, in the relationship between writing in dialect or sort of neo-dialect in Italy, at the time when Zanzotto was writing, you know, from Pasolini's La Meglio Gioventù to Franco Scattaglini, you have a whole range of poets who write in a volgare. You know, the point that they're making is that you know, theirs is also Italian. It is in as much as it is vulgare, and so that is, but that is but that is indeed the difference, I think, with a British or American context, where you don't have that kind of issue, if you like, and you're not sort of addressing the language of poetry and, you know, lyric poetry in particular as belonging to a particular kind of development and storia della lingua and so on and so forth. At this point, I've got one small question, but also I was wondering whether, if you both have at hand a text or an excerpt of text of translation that you would like to read, so that we can actually hear what Zanzotto may sound like in English.
Well,
up to you.
Oh,
I don't know. If you don't, it doesn't matter. If you don't, it doesn't matter. But it's just occurred to me that it would be nice.
yeah, I never come to this office only for when I need a internet connection like today.
While you're looking, I'll read one.
Good.
Yes,
Okay.
please. Yes, please. We'd like to hear that.
I'll read the self-commenting conclusion to I personetto, the one that's called postilla in Italian. All right. So this is Zanzotto addressing the sonnet. So my version. You, sum of unreal summits, my land, you flake into naught, yet visibly sustain grubs changing into gods, change loss to gain, and make invention and emprise anew. Your strivings trip from untrue to untrue, but in so various and unending chain, that all that here is rottenness or bane, there to a match or meld with truth slips through. And I, false too, clone of so false a breed, or addled with a father's fault made worse, make packing words my deed or my misdeed. Thus have I used you once more to my end, sonnet, you infamous purloining verse, mandala in which my beggar's crusts are penned.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I
John,
have-
did you manage to find something?
I did. So this from World Literature Today, spring 1997. I think this is one of our better, Ruth and I, one of our better efforts. It's chairmakers, chairmenders. Here come the chairmakers, almost a secret society in themselves. They use a jargon no one else knows. The gnawing in their bellies grows. Here's the first one to arrive. He stuffs the chair and in the straw leaves a herring for the cat to claw. So the next mender, who's his friend, will also find a chair to mend, and so on without end.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think Adele and Roberto, if you're there, I was wondering whether, I'm sure that there are questions from the audience, so I'd be keen to sort of allow that to happen. Adele?
No, I just sorry, my voice. I just wanted to say that we still have around 10 minutes before 7. So if there are any questions, I think we do have time.
Yeah, may I? Yeah. Okay. A few remarks on. Thank you both, indeed, and thank you for the readings. It'd be great to have more of that. I understand how difficult it is to propose a new poet to a new market. Let's speak of the market. It's from what you said, the market, and from what I know, the market, the English-speaking market of literary books, of foreign literary books, is quite small and reluctant to take in new, authors. You, Peter, kept going back to the idea of a normal language, but poetry is never normal, and the market has got to come to terms with that. So I understand that it's really difficult because the market is not ready to take anything abnormal. I think with that, with Zanzotto, maybe, you did an amazing job with the sonnet, with the hyper sonnet, and I would like to know where I can find the translations because I'd like to have them. But don't you think, both of you, that a good way, Zanzotto is such a complex poet and yet such a deserving poet, that maybe you want to start not from dialect, not from, Fosfeni, which is too hard, but maybe from some very affable poetry, from Vocativo, from Dietro il Paesaggio. Plus, I know Zanzotto was fonder of La Beltà, of Le Ecloghe. Even those, actually, they're quite accessible. I think that these translations should come with some commentary. Just think of Pound in Italy. Pound was so difficult to import. Eliot. And nonetheless, the Italian market, let's speak, in very basic terms. The Italian market is definitely more receptive as far as translations are concerned. The Italians have always translated more than the English or the Americans, and this is still the case today. So to just sum up, it's very hard to export the poetry of Zanzotto into the English-speaking world because the English-speaking world translates less. Plus, this poet is extremely difficult. Plus, maybe the translators have chosen the most difficult things by this poet. So it's just an idea. We need I'm not very much informed about, updated on what's available now in English, what's, what you can buy. But I think there was, poetry, but
You're dying.
it's the time. And I think, pardon me?
We're losing you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I know the connection is very bad in my room. I'm very sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No, I mean, I'm just saying that I'm aware of the difficulties of, having translations of Zanzotto published, but I think we would want to create, translations that are commented on, annotated with a nice introduction, or publishers will just tell you, I don't need this.
Yeah.
I'm not going to sell it. I'm not going to sell it. I mean, you may tell me this is a genius. So what?
Yeah.
I mean, because publishers want to, unless it's, of course, a very small press, in which case small presses are very adventurous. But, a nice anthology published by Faber and Faber, or Farrar, Straus and Giroux. I mean, the great publishers, the great presses that have splendid collections. Why not go to Jonathan Galassi and tell him, Jonathan, you've got the most amazing collection of poetry in America. You are the translator of Leopardi and Montale. Come on, do some some Zanzotto. In that case, I think an annotated edition would be really needed. Interestingly, I'm speaking of Jonathan Galassi, translated his Montale with annotations and with a long introduction. And the same is true of Leopardi. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to stop here.
Well, speaking of the market, and I understand exactly what you're talking about. Jonathan Galassi is a very good translator. He's also an excellent translator. He's also in the publishing world, right? So he works as an editor, and so I think that helps. Not to say that what he has to offer itself doesn't stand on its own, but there was a very small group of gatekeepers, that can open the door at those levels. There are the American academic presses, but I think your suggestion is a good one, Nicola, in that one has to think about a project that can fit into the parameters. And I know Giovanni Zanzotto suggested to me a few years ago that I take a look at Luoghi e Paesaggi, and I've read it a couple times, thinking about translating it. And I think the kind of project that you're describing might exactly, coalesce around something like that, thematic.
Mm-hmm.
Thematic. And I think Luoghi e Paesaggi, they're wonderful texts in Italian. You're going to have to work with them a bit in English, but to have it work for, say, a university press, to have high quality translations that are meaningful selections from Zanzotto's work, have it thematic, have the notes, all the notes you want. With the University of Illinois Press, we were able to have, with a little subvention from my university, have 3 trilingual texts. And so university presses are available for that kind of a project. It has to be done in the right way, and it has to have substance, right? And so I think that kind of a translation probably still has a future.
I think so.
And I thank you, Giovanni, for recommending that I take another look at that. There's some good things there.
As regards the English market, I'm not sure about the word market because you're never going to get large sales. But as regards English publishers, what I think that the main poetry publishers like Faber and Carcanet here will not be sympathetic to Zanzotto unless, precisely as Nicola suggested, it is the poetry of the earlier poetry, the dialect poetry, the poetry which can stand more obviously on the page and look in English as if it has got a discursive quality. Now, you said quite rightly, Nicola, there is a problem well, I was talking about normal language. I was using that as something that was very widely embracing, because of course there's a great many varieties of normal language. I do actually think that over the last few years, there's been a greater conformism in English poetry, and that more and more English poets have been working within a not very interesting radius of language, which is one reason why they're not so interesting. There are some who are doing other things, like Paul Muldoon, say, Simon Armitage, perhaps. But at the same time, there is not. I mean, there is a sense in which poetry was already observing Brexit before it happened. An openness to the kind of things that Zanzotto does, he will not easily occur. And commentaries, we don't like commentaries.
I know.
It should stand by itself, shouldn't it? I mean, that's the point. But I agree. I think it is terribly, terribly difficult because we so want the presence of contemporary Italian poetry to be heard and felt. But it is very difficult to work out what the best strategy is in order to do that. If there aren't any other questions,
Could I just say?
May I say something also?
yes.
Sorry.
Stefano, sorry.
First of all, I have to say I'm sorry to John, because just before I made my compliments to the young people and not to you, while your keynote lecture made me laugh and cry, and so just sorry.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. I mean,
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
No, what I wanted to say now is I think Andrea Zanzotto has one big point from his side, which is the fact that he is a poet of contents. I mean, his contents are so many, so deep, so even if you lose or you miss 9/10 of what he's saying, what stays there anyway is enough. I mean, one thing I would say to the translators is just betray him, just keep what you can keep, just keep what you can, because and that's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing is I agree with Nicola. I think any of Zanzotto's book contain at least 4 or 5 poems, just readable and just approachable. For instance, the whole 9 Egloge to me is a book which is worth to translate it. I mean, what do you think about that? I think Nicola.
Yes, I completely agree. I think that vocativo could be translated, nove ecloge, and it would be also nice to go around the very difficult books and cherry pick the very. Tu e io siamo innamorati di Genti, no?
Yeah, that's a wonderful poem and just translatable.
È nel mezzo di un testo complesso, di un libro complessissimo, però salta fuori. E cose così ce ne sono, come dici tu, Stefano, parecchie. Quindi sì, è un lavoro anche proprio
ben
di...
disposti silenzi. There are a lot of poems which are, let's say, short poems also. No?
Also, yes.
But I would like to say something. Hello to everybody, and thanks for the very nice lectures today for everybody. But just touching on this point, can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, no, touching on this point, I would think that the first thing is that someone like Stefano or Nicola or Andrea Cortellesi, someone needs to take the axe and cherry pick among all the axe, not the axe, but maybe the tweezers, and take out what they like a short. Even in Italian, a short selected poems type thing is missing. And Mondadori did not want to do it in the last few years. I've been proposing to them. But that needs to be done also because the readership in Italy is not so wide. And that could be the basis for then a translation in German or in
That's a good idea.
something that is reasoned now that everything has been said and done. Also, the ratici are established more or less, as we've seen. Oh, by the way, I just wanted to make a note to the text that John found. It's on a artist's book, and those were not because of lockdown we couldn't go and get we can go to Pieve and really go through all the so all those. There is going to be another 20 that are going to emerge.
Oh,
So,
wow.
but we could not establish those erratici that were in the artist books. But anyway, so I would like to just make an invitation to the people in Italy, but even with the contributions from someone from abroad, to make a selection, a reason, and that is like an updated version of Agosti's Oscar, basically. And that would be with some notes, and that would be the basis also for translations in other languages that could enlarge the readership, first and foremost in Italy, but also abroad, of course. So I think that job needs to be done. I can't do it, but you guys can do it.
Yeah, no, that would be a convenient shortcut to the English speaking market, and maybe even the French or the.
Well, I always talk to the Mondadori executives. They say, well, we need to the box of chocolates. We think that good students still there will be some, not too many, but students give each other as a gift on a birthday. Something that is manageable, is readable, and I don't think necessarily it must be completely castrated of all the experimental, more difficult parts, but some of that can stay. But an overview is missing anyway. So
allora, Giovanni,
it's my invitation to everybody to work on that.
Se posso. Giovanni, allora noi italiani, diciamo, io e Stefano e Andrea facciamo un gioco, ognuno fa la sua classifica e poi ci confrontiamo, e magari John and Peter will do the same. They will pick what they think is most accessible, and then we will cooperate. No, I'm not kidding, really. I think because there are, I mean, this, I work a lot with, it's so hard, but there are so many ways to study Latin. You don't necessarily need to start from, the hardest Cicero or Tacitus, difficulties are in all authors, and even author needs to be, proposed to a larger readership. Do it. Yeah, Giovanni is extremely helpful. And anyway, thank you very much for being with us for the entire day.
Yeah, I look forward to tomorrow also. I don't know if I can stay for the whole day like today, but it was very nice. But can I steal 2 minutes with a question that because I heard and it resonated with me Peter's comment that my father's language and tone, everything is more accessible in dialect, which is absolutely true. And I wonder two things. Is that because I don't know enough of the panorama that is around his work in So both in Italy and abroad, is there such a thing? So in Italy, we know there is dialect poesia, and I don't like to call it neo-dialettale, but poesia in dialetto. So in all the little or more or less local languages, and it flourishes, and I think it's very nice, and it's always more intelligible than standard Italian language. And I'm wondering, is that a wrong impression, first thing? And second thing, for those who know Italy, what is going on in Italy. And the second thing is there anything like that also, for instance, in the English language, or so that people experiment and work with both languages, but in their own somehow mother tongue or local whatever jargon, or not jargon, they are more intelligible, and or this was just some my father's idiosyncratic thing.
Well,
You know what I mean?
well, certainly linguistic communities that do speak a kind of dialect in this country, and the Scottish one is particularly the case. So there is a Scottish lowland Scottish literature. But that poetry, I suspect, is not read by very many people, because we're not accustomed to reading a written form of a Scottish dialect. You can understand it more if you hear it than if you read it. And then you may still have difficulty. But a language like Newcastle, which is very difficult for most people to understand, does not, so far as I know, have an established dialect literature. I think it's very uncommon in the United Kingdom.